My beloved child, something unusual happened the moment your photograph touched that table, because the reaction they expected never came. The third party had arrived with your special person's ex carrying a quiet confidence, almost as if they had already decided what the psychic would say before a single word was spoken. They believed your picture would confirm the story they had been repeating to themselves, that you were temporary, that whatever connection existed could easily be explained away, that your special person would eventually look backward instead of forward. But the psychic did not immediately look at them. She looked at the photograph. Then she looked away. And for several long seconds, the room became strangely still. Not frightening. Not dramatic in the way anyone had imagined. Just still enough for both of them to realize that something had shifted. The ex leaned forward first, waiting for a simple answer, while the third party watched the psychic's expression change from curiosity to something far more difficult to read. "What do you see?" came the question. The psychic remained quiet. That silence mattered, because she had been shown photographs before. She was accustomed to people arriving with complicated histories, unfinished relationships, jealousy, hope, and questions they were almost afraid to ask. But something about this situation was different, not because your photograph carried some impossible supernatural secret, but because the story surrounding you did not seem to match the person they had expected her to describe. And when she finally spoke, she did not begin by talking about romance. She said something much simpler. "This person has been misunderstood." Those words landed differently than anyone expected. The third party shifted slightly. Your special person's ex gave a small, uncertain laugh, as though waiting for the psychic to correct herself. But she didn't. Instead, she studied the photograph again, and what happened next began unraveling the assumptions they had carried into that room. Don't skip, because the most important part was not what she believed about your future. It was what she noticed about the way other people had been interpreting you. There are moments when someone can know your name, see your face, even hear stories about you, and still never actually know your heart. They can build an entire version of you from fragments: someone else's frustration, someone else's insecurity, someone else's unfinished emotions, and eventually that version becomes easier for them to believe than the truth. Perhaps you understand that feeling more deeply than most. Perhaps there have been times when you remained quiet because defending yourself would have required explaining parts of your heart to people who had already decided not to understand. Perhaps you learned that not every misunderstanding deserves a battle. And strangely, that was the first thing the psychic seemed to notice in the story being told around your photograph. She asked them one unexpected question: has this person ever actually done what you're accusing them of doing? Neither answered immediately. That hesitation changed the atmosphere. Because until that moment, they had been speaking confidently about intentions, motives, possibilities, but when asked for something real, something specific, their certainty began to thin. Your special person's ex looked toward the third party. The third party looked back at the photograph. The psychic noticed. And then she said quietly, "You didn't come here because you know who this person is. You came here because you're afraid of what they mean to someone you still care about." The ex stopped smiling. It wasn't anger that moved across their face. It was recognition. The kind that arrives when somebody places into words the thought you have been avoiding inside yourself. Stay till the end, because that realization was only the surface. The psychic had not yet said the sentence that would make the ex completely lose composure. She began asking about your special person instead. Not about dates or predictions. Not about guarantees. She asked how your special person behaved when your name appeared in conversation. Did they become defensive? Did they become quiet? Did they suddenly change the subject? Did they remember tiny details about you without realizing they were doing it? The third party's confidence began slipping because those questions sounded uncomfortably familiar. There had been moments they had dismissed. A pause when your name was mentioned. A certain expression when someone spoke unfairly about you. A message left unanswered because your special person was staring at an old memory instead. Nothing dramatic by itself. Yet together, those tiny moments formed a pattern no one in that room wanted to acknowledge. The psychic slowly placed the photograph back on the table and said, "Maybe you are asking the wrong question." The ex immediately asked what she meant. And the answer came gently, "You keep asking why this person has such an effect. Maybe you should ask what they awakened." That sentence changed everything. Because there is a difference between someone entering your life and someone awakening a part of you that had gone quiet. One can be replaced easily. The other becomes connected to growth, honesty, memory, and the version of yourself you discovered while knowing them. Your special person had not simply noticed you. Something in your presence had apparently forced them to notice themselves. Their choices. Their patterns. The things they had been avoiding. The kind of love they actually wanted to give and receive. And that possibility unsettled the ex more than any prediction could have. The ex had expected competition. What they heard instead sounded like transformation. And transformation is difficult to compete with because it is not about being better than another person. It is about timing. It is about what a connection reveals inside someone. The third party tried to interrupt, insisting that perhaps your special person was simply confused. But the psychic shook her head gently. "Confusion makes people forget," she said. "Whatever this is, they keep remembering." There it was again, that uncomfortable pause. Something important is waiting for you, because the next detail came from the ex, not the psychic. Almost accidentally, they admitted that your special person had once said something about you during a private conversation. A sentence the ex had never forgotten. They had said, with them, "I didn't have to pretend I was okay." The psychic's expression softened immediately. And perhaps those words touch something inside you too, because being meaningful to someone does not always look like dramatic declarations. Sometimes your greatest impact is the place of honesty you created without trying. The moment another person felt they could remove the performance and simply exist. Maybe you never realized how much your calm mattered. Maybe you thought your patience went unnoticed. Maybe you wondered whether the conversations you shared meant as much to them as they meant to you. Yet there are things people understand only after distance gives them enough silence to hear themselves clearly. The ex looked down at your photograph again, but now the energy behind that gaze had changed. It was no longer merely curiosity. It was comparison. Not comparison of appearance or status, but of emotional impact. And that was where the composure began to disappear. "So what are you saying?" the ex finally asked. The psychic did not answer quickly. She took a breath and said, I'm saying this photograph is not your problem. The ex stared at her. Then what is? The psychic responded, the meaning you've attached to it. That was the sentence that broke through every defense. Suddenly the ex began speaking faster, insisting they were not jealous, insisting they had moved forward, insisting this was only about understanding why your special person had changed. But each explanation revealed more than it concealed. Their voice became emotional. Their questions overlapped. The calm confidence they had entered with vanished, replaced by the realization that perhaps they had spent far too much time studying you when the real answer had always been inside their own unfinished feelings. The psychic let them speak. Then, when the room finally became quiet again, she said something unexpectedly compassionate. You do not need to defeat this person. You need to stop measuring yourself against them. And that softened everything. Because this was never supposed to become a story about one person winning while another loses. No meaningful connection needs another human being to be humiliated in order to matter. What the psychic revealed was simpler and more human. Your special person's ex had been trying to understand your importance by turning you into a rival, when perhaps you represented something entirely different, a chapter of growth your special person had not experienced before. And the third party had been pulled into that comparison because uncertainty is contagious when people keep feeding it. For the first time that evening, neither of them looked at you as an enemy. They looked at your photograph as a question. What had your special person found in your presence that made them remember you differently? What had changed inside them? Why did your name carry such weight even when nobody was trying to give it power? The psychic reached toward the photograph one final time. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not from fear, but concentration. Then she noticed something she had missed at the beginning. A tiny detail in your expression. Something ordinary enough that anyone else would have ignored it. Yet it caused her to ask one final question about the very first moment your special person met you. And when the third party answered, the psychic suddenly understood why everything afterward had unfolded the way it did. She leaned back, looked from the ex to the third party, and quietly said, "Now it makes sense." But what she explained next was not about your photograph at all. It was about a promise your special person had apparently made to themselves long before you ever entered their life, a promise they had already broken the moment they realized what they felt around you. The promise had nothing to do with you at first, and that was exactly why the psychic's next words changed the entire mood in the room. Long before you entered your special person's life, they had quietly decided they would never again become deeply attached to someone who could see through them. They had been disappointed before, misunderstood before, and somewhere along the way they learned how to keep certain parts of themselves hidden behind humor, distance, busyness, or silence. They could care about someone without letting that person reach the deepest rooms inside them. At least, that was what they believed. Then you arrived. Not dramatically. Not with some perfect moment that announced what you would become to them. You simply began noticing things other people missed. You heard the change in their voice when they said they were fine. You remembered details they had forgotten telling you. You understood when they needed space without making that space feel like punishment. And slowly, without either of you fully realizing it, the promise your special person had made to remain emotionally guarded began falling apart. The psychic looked directly at the ex and said, "That is why this feels different to them. This person did not force the door open. They made it feel safe enough to open on its own. The X went completely quiet. Because suddenly an old memory returned, something your special person had said months earlier, perhaps casually, perhaps without knowing how revealing it sounded. They had once admitted, "I don't understand why I tell them things I never planned to tell anyone." At the time, the X had dismissed it. Now those words carried a different meaning. The third party shifted uncomfortably and asked whether that meant your special person was still emotionally attached to you. But the psychic refused to reduce everything to such a simple answer. "Attachment is not the most interesting part," she said. "The interesting part is what happened to them after this person entered their life." That sentence caused another silence because both visitors already knew the answer. Your special person had begun changing. Not overnight, and not in obvious ways. They started questioning choices they had once accepted without thought. They became more careful with their words. They stopped tolerating certain patterns simply because they were familiar. They began thinking about what peace actually felt like instead of chasing whatever looked exciting from the outside. And the strangest part was that some of those changes continued even when you were not physically present. That was what unsettled the X most deeply. If your influence disappeared whenever you disappeared, perhaps it could have been dismissed as temporary emotion. But your special person had carried certain lessons forward. They remembered how it felt to be listened to. They remembered how it felt when somebody noticed the person beneath the performance. They remembered the version of themselves that existed around you. Don't skip, because this is where the X finally asked the question they had been avoiding since entering the room: why them? It came out softer than expected. Not angry now. Almost vulnerable. Why you? Why had your presence affected someone they had known for so long? Why did your name still change the atmosphere? Why did your special person seem unable to place you in the same category as everyone else who had passed through their life? The psychic looked at your photograph for several seconds before replying. Maybe because this person never tried to become unforgettable. That answer landed heavily. You see, some people try to leave an impression. They perform. They persuade. They make sure their presence is noticed. But sometimes the deepest impressions are made accidentally through consistency, kindness, honesty, and those small moments that seemed ordinary while they were happening. Perhaps you have wondered whether you should have said more, done more, explained yourself better, shown your value more clearly. Yet the things your special person remembered were not grand gestures. They remembered how you responded when they were uncertain. They remembered the conversation where you could have judged them but chose understanding instead. They remembered a moment when you could have demanded reassurance but chose dignity. They remembered how you never seemed interested in controlling what they felt. And that freedom made them think about you even more. The third party suddenly interrupted. But they walked away from each other. The psychic nodded. Sometimes distance happens because feelings are weak, she replied. And sometimes distance happens because people do not yet know what to do with feelings that are stronger than the version of themselves they are used to being. Nobody answered. Not because the statement proved anything about what would happen next, but because it explained something both visitors had witnessed. Your special person had not looked peaceful after the distance began. They had looked thoughtful. Different. More inward. There were days when they seemed perfectly normal, then something small would happen, a song, a familiar phrase, a place they had visited, an unexpected reminder, and their expression would change for half a second. The ex had noticed it. The third party had noticed it too. Neither wanted to admit how often. Stay till the end, because the psychic was about to reveal something neither of them had mentioned to her. She picked up your photograph again and asked, "Which one of you has been watching how they react whenever this person is mentioned?" The third party immediately glanced toward the ex. That glance answered more than words could. Apparently, they had both been paying attention. Not obsessively, not constantly, but enough to notice a pattern. Whenever someone spoke dismissively about you, your special person did something subtle. They became quieter. They rarely argued openly. They rarely defended you with dramatic speeches. But they stopped participating. They changed their tone. Sometimes they simply left the conversation. That restraint had been mistaken for indifference. The psychic saw it differently. People often reveal what matters by what they refuse to disrespect, she said. And suddenly the ex remembered another moment. Someone had once made a careless joke about you while your special person was nearby. Everybody else laughed. Your special person did not. They simply looked down, then said, "You don't know them well enough to say that." 6 ordinary words. Nothing dramatic. Yet the ex had remembered them all this time. Why? Because of the way they had been said. Calmly. Firmly. Without performance. That memory seemed to undo something inside the ex. Their frustration softened into something more complicated, sadness, perhaps, but also understanding. They finally admitted that they had spent months assuming your importance came from something you were doing behind the scenes. Maybe you were contacting your special person constantly. Maybe you were making promises. Maybe you were trying to pull them away from everyone else. But the truth was almost the opposite. Much of the impact had been created by what you did not do. You did not chase every silence. You did not demand every answer. You did not turn every uncertainty into conflict. You left room for your special person to discover their own feelings. And room can be powerful. When someone has space, there is nowhere for them to hide from their own thoughts. The psychic placed the photograph down carefully and said, "Perhaps this person's greatest influence was never persuasion. Perhaps it was contrast." The third party frowned. Contrast with what? The psychic answered gently, with everything that felt forced before. That realization seemed to travel through the room slowly. Your special person had experienced connections where they felt expected to perform, explain, prove, reassure, or fit into somebody else's version of who they should be. Around you, something felt simpler. That simplicity had frightened them at first because peace can feel unfamiliar to someone accustomed to emotional noise. They may even have mistaken calmness for uncertainty. They may have pulled back because the connection did not follow the patterns they understood. Yet after distance came, they began noticing what was missing. Not drama. Not excitement. Something quieter. The feeling of being understood without having to translate themselves constantly. Something important is waiting for you, because the ex suddenly remembered a message your special person had sent them long ago. It had been written after a difficult conversation, and at the time its meaning seemed unclear. The message said, "I think I met someone who made me realize how tired I was." The ex had assumed your special person meant tired of relationships. But now another interpretation appeared. Maybe they had been tired of pretending. Tired of repeating cycles. Tired of becoming smaller to keep familiar situations comfortable. And perhaps meeting you had not immediately solved anything. Perhaps it simply gave them a comparison point. Once a person experiences a different kind of emotional safety, it becomes difficult to pretend they never felt it. The psychic watched the ex process this, then said something surprisingly gentle. "This does not mean the past meant nothing. It means the past taught them what they could no longer ignore." That was the first time the ex seemed to breathe fully since the reading began. Because suddenly the story was not about being replaced. Their history still mattered. Their memories still existed. But someone's next chapter does not erase the chapters that came before it. It simply reveals what they have learned. And you, without intentionally trying to, may have entered your special person's life at precisely the moment they were ready to recognize what those lessons meant. The third party, however, still seemed unconvinced. They leaned forward and asked the one question that changed the direction of the entire reading. If this person matters so much, why hasn't anything happened yet? The psychic's expression shifted again. This time she did not look at your photograph. She looked directly at the third party. Because meaning and readiness are not the same thing. The room became quiet again. Your special person could recognize your importance and still be learning how to handle it. They could miss you and still remain silent. They could understand what changed and still need time to become someone capable of responding differently. There was no guarantee hidden in the reading, no promise of some perfect outcome, only an honest recognition. Sometimes the deepest emotional realizations happen long before a person knows what action to take. And perhaps that is why this chapter has felt unfinished. Not because nothing was happening, but because much of what mattered was happening privately, beneath visible behavior. Then the psychic noticed the third party's face. "You already know something," she said. The third party froze. The ex turned toward them immediately. What does she mean? For several seconds, nobody answered. Then the third party admitted something they had not planned to reveal that evening. Just 3 nights earlier, your special person had spoken about you when they believed no one important was listening. It had happened during an ordinary conversation. Your name had not even been the topic. Someone had simply asked your special person what they regretted most about the past year. They had gone silent for a long moment before answering with one sentence. A sentence the third party had kept secret because they knew the ex would never hear the situation the same way afterward. Now the psychic asked them to repeat it exactly. The third party hesitated, glanced once at your photograph, and finally whispered what your special person had said. "I regret acting like losing them didn't change me." The ex's eyes widened. But the psychic remained unusually calm, because what interested her was not the regret itself. It was one particular word in that sentence. "Change," she said softly. Then she asked the third party something so specific that both of them immediately realized she had reached the real heart of the story. what changed? What changed was not the feeling, it was the way your special person could no longer hide from what that feeling had revealed about them. The third party stared at the psychic as if the question had reached somewhere they had been trying not to look, because they had seen the change with their own eyes. Your special person had become more careful after losing contact with you. More thoughtful before speaking. Less willing to entertain connections that felt empty simply because being alone was uncomfortable. They had stopped explaining away their own emotions. They had even begun revisiting choices they once defended without hesitation. And the strangest part was that nobody had asked them to change. You certainly had not. That was what made your influence difficult for the X to understand. If you had demanded transformation, they could have blamed you for it. If you had pressured your special person to become different, they could have dismissed everything as temporary behavior. But you had simply existed in their life long enough for them to notice something about themselves they could no longer unsee. The psychic leaned slightly forward and said, "Sometimes the person who changes us most is not the person who tells us what to become. It is the person beside whom we finally recognize what we have been pretending not to need." The X lowered their eyes. There was no dramatic response this time. Just silence. A softer silence than before. The kind that comes when comparison begins turning into acceptance. Perhaps that is why this story feels personal to you too. Maybe you have wondered whether your quiet presence ever mattered because you were never the loudest person in the room. Maybe you questioned whether someone could truly remember the patience, understanding, and emotional safety you offered when those things never seemed dramatic enough to leave a mark. Yet people often forget exact conversations while remembering how they felt inside them. Your special person may not remember every sentence you shared, but they remember the strange relief of not having to defend every emotion. They remember how your presence made certain walls feel unnecessary. They remember feeling noticed without feeling watched. And that memory had followed them longer than anyone in that room realized. Don't skip, because the third party suddenly admitted that the biggest change had appeared whenever your special person met someone new. In the past, they could move quickly, letting attraction or attention carry them forward without asking many deeper questions. But after you, something was different. They began comparing feelings, not people, feelings. Did this conversation feel genuine? Could they speak without rehearsing every sentence? Did they feel peaceful afterward, or simply distracted? Could they be quiet around someone without needing to fill every second? Those questions had never mattered so much before. Now they mattered constantly. The X looked at the psychic and asked, "So they compare everyone to this person?" The psychic shook her head. Not exactly. They compare who they are around everyone else to who they were around this person. That distinction changed the room again. Because perhaps your special person was not searching for another version of you. Perhaps they were searching for the version of themselves they had discovered beside you. And each time a new connection failed to awaken that same honesty, your memory returned not as an obsession, not as some impossible ideal, but as a reference point. A quiet reminder that deeper emotional ease had existed once. The third party had noticed this too. There had been conversations where your special person seemed interested in someone, only to pull back unexpectedly. There had been moments when everything appeared to be moving forward, yet your special person would suddenly say something was missing. They could never explain what. Now the psychic seemed to understand. They are no longer satisfied with being liked, she said. They want to feel known. The X closed their eyes for a moment. That sentence seemed to touch something deeper than jealousy because perhaps they, too, finally understood that nobody in this story was being judged as better or worse. Your special person had simply reached a different emotional stage. What once felt acceptable no longer felt complete. Stay till the end, because then the psychic asked to hear the exact story of how you and your special person first became close. The third party knew only fragments. The X knew even less. Yet between them, they began reconstructing something your special person had mentioned over time. There had been no grand beginning. No instant declaration. It had started with ordinary conversations. A joke that became a longer exchange. A moment of unexpected honesty. A day when your special person was carrying something difficult and you noticed without being told. Perhaps you did not even realize how important that moment became. You may have said something simple, something you have long forgotten. But your special person remembered because it arrived when they needed understanding more than advice. The X asked what you had said. The third party hesitated, then repeated the line your special person had once mentioned, "You don't have to explain everything right now. I'm still here." The room went still. Not because those words sounded extraordinary, but because they were so ordinary. So gentle. So different from the pressure your special person had become accustomed to. There had been people who wanted immediate answers. People who interpreted silence as rejection. People who required reassurance before allowing your special person time to understand themselves. You did something different. You left space without withdrawing warmth. And somewhere inside that small moment, trust had taken root. The psychic smiled faintly and said, that was probably when they began seeing this person differently. The X looked confused. From one sentence? The psychic shook her head. Not from the sentence. From what the sentence showed. It showed patience. It showed emotional steadiness. It showed that your presence did not depend on forcing your special person into a particular response. And perhaps that was rare enough in their life to become unforgettable. Something important is waiting for you, because the third party then revealed that your special person had recently returned to that exact memory. They had mentioned it only days ago. Not dramatically. They were sitting alone after a long conversation with someone else when they suddenly said, "There was one person who never made me feel guilty for needing time." The third party had known immediately who they meant. They had not asked your name. They did not need to. The X's expression changed completely after hearing this. They no longer looked angry. They looked almost stunned by how many small pieces had existed around them without forming a complete picture until now. Then why didn't they just say all of this to them? The X asked. The psychic's answer came quietly. Because sometimes people realize the value of safety only after they have already stepped away from it. There was no accusation in her voice. Your special person was not being painted as cruel or careless. They had simply reacted from whatever emotional tools they possessed at the time. Perhaps closeness made them vulnerable. Perhaps vulnerability made them uncertain. Perhaps uncertainty made distance feel easier than honesty. But distance had created an unexpected consequence. Without your presence nearby, they could finally measure what your presence had been giving them. And that realization did not necessarily tell them what to do next. It simply made pretending harder. The third party asked, "Do they want this person back?" The psychic paused before answering because she refused to turn emotional complexity into a guarantee. "I cannot tell you what choice they will make," she said. "But I can tell you the question they seem unable to escape: why did I walk away from something that felt peaceful?" That question touched the X more deeply than anything else said that evening. They looked at your photograph again, but now there was something almost respectful in their expression. The need to compete had begun dissolving because the more they understood, the clearer it became that your importance was not created by defeating anyone. It had grown from something much quieter: how your special person experienced themselves around you. Then something completely unexpected happened. The X asked if they could hold your photograph. The third party looked surprised but handed it over. For several seconds, the X simply studied your face. Then they gave a small, almost embarrassed laugh and said, "I spent so much time imagining this person was trying to take something from me." The psychic asked, "And now?" The X answered, "Now I think they probably never knew I was competing with them at all." That realization softened the entire room. Because you may have been carrying your own questions somewhere else, unaware that people had built stories around you that you never participated in. You may have been focusing on healing, moving forward, understanding yourself, while others were trying to decode why your name still mattered. And perhaps there is something freeing in knowing that you do not have to manage every interpretation of you. Your character speaks most clearly through consistency over time. The psychic reached for the photograph again, but before taking it, she asked the X one final question: "If this person never intended to compete with you, what exactly made you so afraid of them?" The X swallowed. The answer took time. Then they said something nobody expected, "Because when my X talked about them, they sounded like the person I always hoped they would become with me." The third party said nothing. Neither did the psychic. That confession carried no bitterness now. Only truth. Your special person had become softer when speaking about you. More reflective. More accountable. They had begun admitting their own mistakes rather than blaming circumstances. And for the X, perhaps the hardest realization was not that your special person cared about you. It was that caring about you seemed to awaken qualities they had once begged to see. That did not mean you were responsible for your special person's growth. It meant timing had mattered. People sometimes hear the same lesson repeatedly and only understand it when they are finally ready. You happened to arrive near that moment of readiness. The psychic carefully returned the photograph to the table and said, "Then this person is not the reason your old relationship changed. They are evidence that your special person changed." The X nodded slowly. Something in them appeared to settle. Yet the third party was becoming increasingly uneasy, because while the X was releasing comparison, the third party was remembering something else, something they had deliberately kept out of the conversation. The psychic noticed immediately. "There is still something you haven't said," she told them. The third party denied it at first. The psychic did not press. She simply waited. Finally, the X turned toward them and asked, "What happened?" The third party looked down at the table. 3 nights earlier, after your special person made that confession about regretting how they handled losing you, something else had happened. They had opened their phone. They had searched for something connected to you. Not to contact you. Not yet. They had simply opened an old conversation and scrolled until they found one particular message. The third party had accidentally seen the screen from across the room. One line was visible. Your line. A sentence you had sent long ago, perhaps during one of the last difficult moments between you. The psychic asked what it said. The third party hesitated, because now even they seemed to understand why those words had stayed with your special person. Finally, they repeated them. I never needed you to be perfect. I only needed you to be honest with me. The psychic's expression changed instantly. She looked at the X, then at the third party, then back at your photograph. That, she whispered, is what they are finally ready to understand. But before anyone could ask what she meant, the third party revealed there was one more detail about that night because after reading your old message, your special person had typed something beneath it. They did not send it. They deleted it moments later. Yet the third party had seen enough to remember the first 6 words perfectly, and those 6 words were about to reveal exactly what your special person had been unable to admit until now. The 6 words were simple enough to miss, yet powerful enough to explain why your special person had deleted the message before anyone could ever receive it. I should have told you sooner. The third party repeated them slowly, almost reluctantly, and for the first time that evening the psychic stopped studying your photograph and began studying the silence around everyone else. Because those 6 words were not a confession of certainty. They were the beginning of accountability. Your special person had apparently sat with that unfinished sentence for several minutes, typing and deleting different versions afterward, never finding language that felt honest enough to send. I should have told you sooner that. Then nothing. Another attempt. Another deletion. They had stared at the old conversation as though the answer were hidden somewhere between everything you once said and everything they had been too guarded to say back. And strangely, that affected the X more than hearing some dramatic declaration would have. A grand romantic statement could have been dismissed as emotion. But hesitation like this felt different. It suggested that your special person was no longer asking whether you mattered. They were asking how much truth they had withheld while you were still close enough to hear it. The psychic folded her hands and said quietly, that unfinished sentence is probably more important than anything they could have written tonight. The third party frowned. How can something unfinished be important? The psychic answered, because sometimes hesitation shows you exactly where someone's heart and fear are meeting. Your special person wanted honesty, yet honesty would require looking back at their own choices without excuses. They would have to admit that perhaps you had not imagined the connection. They would have to acknowledge that their silence may have communicated something very different from what they actually felt. They would have to recognize that while you were trying to understand what was happening, they may have been protecting themselves by leaving you with questions they themselves were afraid to answer. And perhaps that is why this chapter has felt so difficult to interpret from the outside. Silence can look like indifference even when it comes from uncertainty. Distance can look like forgetting even while someone is privately revisiting every decision that created it. None of that guarantees what happens next, but it changes the meaning of what happened before. Don't skip, because the psychic suddenly asked the third party whether your special person had ever finished that sentence somewhere else, not in the message, but aloud. The third party immediately said no. Then paused. Their expression changed. There had been another moment. The following morning, your special person had been standing by a window with their phone in their hand when someone asked why they looked distracted. They had laughed it off at first, but eventually said something almost under their breath. I think I let someone believe they meant less to me than they actually did. The ex looked away when those words were repeated. Not because they were angry anymore, but because they finally understood the real reason your photograph had unsettled them so deeply. They had spent all this time imagining that your special person had chosen you over them in some obvious competition. But the truth was messier and far more human. Your special person had not fully chosen anything yet. They had been learning, slowly and imperfectly, what their own behavior had cost them. The psychic looked toward your photograph again. This is why you cannot reduce people to winners and losers, she said. Sometimes one relationship teaches someone what they need. Another teaches them what they fear. Another teaches them what they should have said sooner. Growth does not make the past worthless. It simply changes what someone is capable of understanding. The ex nodded, and something softened visibly in their face. Perhaps, for the first time, they were no longer trying to prove that your importance had been exaggerated. They were beginning to see that your special person's response to you had very little to do with comparison and everything to do with recognition. Something about knowing you had exposed a gap between how they wanted to love and how they had actually been showing up. And once someone notices that gap, it becomes difficult to ignore. You may understand this more than anyone. There may have been moments when you sensed your special person cared more deeply than they allowed themselves to express, yet you refused to build your life around hints. You needed honesty. You needed consistency. You needed words and actions to belong in the same story. Perhaps that is why your old message had remained with them. I never needed you to be perfect. I only needed you to be honest with me. You were not asking them to become flawless. You were asking them to stop hiding behind uncertainty while leaving you to carry the emotional consequences. And now, long after that message was sent, its meaning had finally reached them. Stay till the end, because what happened next surprised even the third party. The ex placed your photograph back onto the table and said, I think I understand why they couldn't forget this person. The psychic corrected them gently. Maybe forgetting was never the real issue. The ex looked confused. Then what was? The psychic replied, integration. She explained that some people try to move forward by placing an important connection into a sealed compartment, something finished, something they no longer have to examine. But if that connection taught them something essential about themselves, it refuses to remain neatly sealed. It returns in choices. It returns in standards. It returns when they meet someone new and notice what feels different. It returns when they finally understand why an old conversation hurt. Not because they are trapped in the past, but because they have not yet integrated the lesson into who they are becoming. Your special person had been trying to move forward without fully acknowledging what knowing you taught them. And every time they encountered a similar emotional moment, your memory became a mirror. Not a chain. A mirror. The ex whispered, so what did they learn? The psychic's answer came without drama. That being understood is not the same as being admired. That peace is not the same as boredom. That vulnerability is not weakness. And that someone can care deeply while still refusing to accept half-truths. Those last words seemed to settle over the room. Because perhaps that was what distinguished you most clearly in your special person's mind. You cared, but you also had limits. You could offer understanding without abandoning yourself. You could be patient without pretending uncertainty did not affect you. You may have stepped back not because your feelings disappeared, but because your self-respect required you to stop doing emotional work for two people. And your absence may have taught something your presence could not. While you were there, your special person could experience your steadiness without understanding its value. Once that steadiness was removed, the contrast became impossible to ignore. The third party suddenly asked, then why did they delete the message? If they understand all this now, why not just send it? The psychic smiled faintly. Because understanding what you owe someone and being brave enough to offer it are two different stages. That answer changed the atmosphere again. Your special person was not being portrayed as secretly ready with some perfect declaration. They were still moving through their own uncertainty. Perhaps they were asking whether reaching out would be for your benefit or merely to ease their own regret. Perhaps they were wondering whether enough time had passed that reopening the conversation would be unfair. Perhaps they feared discovering that you had grown beyond the version of yourself who once waited for their clarity. And there was something unexpectedly beautiful in that realization. Your life did not have to remain frozen while they figured themselves out. Their awakening did not require your waiting. Your value did not depend on what they eventually chose to do. The psychic seemed to understand this because she turned your photograph slightly toward the X and said, "Notice something. We have spent most of this evening discussing how much this person affected someone else. But who were they becoming while all of this was happening?" The question surprised everyone. Until then, you had existed in their conversation almost entirely as someone important to your special person. But you had your own journey. Your own transformation. Your own nights of wondering followed by mornings when you chose yourself anyway. Your own decisions to stop explaining what should have been understood through basic honesty. Your own quiet rebuilding. Perhaps while your special person was learning how much you mattered, you were learning that being meaningful to someone does not require you to accept uncertainty forever. Something important is waiting for you, because this became the deepest realization of the entire reading. The psychic looked at your photograph and said, maybe the reason this person feels so powerful in your stories is not because they are trying to hold on to anyone. Maybe it is because they learned how to release what they could not control without becoming bitter. The third party did not respond. The X stared at the photograph differently now. Because that possibility explained something else they had never understood. You had not been publicly competing for your special person's attention. You had not been trying to prove your importance. You had simply continued becoming yourself. And paradoxically, that may have made your memory stronger. People often expect someone who cares deeply to chase, argue, convince, or remain available indefinitely. When that person instead chooses dignity, the absence becomes clarifying. Your special person was left not with constant reminders from you, but with their own thoughts. Their own memories. Their own responsibility. The psychic leaned back and said, "That is probably why they are finally asking a different question." The ex asked, "What question?" She replied, "Not, do they still care about me? But, if I ever speak to them again, who do I need to be when I do?" That distinction made everyone quiet. Because the first question seeks reassurance. The second requires growth. Your special person may have begun realizing that simply missing you would never be enough. Simply remembering you would never be enough. Even regret would not be enough. If there were ever another honest conversation between you, they would need to show up differently, not as someone asking you to forget what happened, but as someone capable of acknowledging it. And whether such a conversation ever happened or not, that realization itself mattered. The third party seemed almost relieved by the groundedness of that answer. Yet there was still one thing troubling them. Why did they open the old conversation that night, they asked. Something must have triggered it. The psychic did not guess. Instead, she asked what had happened earlier that evening. The third party thought carefully. Your special person had spent time with someone new. Nothing serious. Just a conversation, apparently pleasant enough from the outside. But when they returned home, they were strangely withdrawn. At one point they had said, "They're wonderful. I just didn't feel like myself." Then they opened your old messages. The ex immediately understood. Your special person had not been comparing appearances, personalities, or worth. They had been comparing internal states again. Around this new person, they had found themselves performing, choosing the right stories, maintaining the right impression, thinking about how they were being perceived. And without meaning to, they remembered what it had felt like around you when the performance dropped. The psychic nodded slowly. That is the contrast. Yet she added something important. It does not mean this new person is wrong for them, and it does not automatically mean your story resumes. It means your special person is finally learning what authenticity feels like to them. That distinction mattered because your connection did not need exaggerated promises to be meaningful. Its value was already visible in the growth it inspired. The ex, now calmer than at any point that evening, asked one final question. Then who is this person really? They gestured toward your photograph. It was the question they had come to ask from the beginning, but now its meaning had completely changed. At first they had wanted a label. A secret identity. Something dramatic enough to explain why your special person cared. The psychic looked at your photograph for a long moment and smiled. Probably much simpler than you wanted the answer to be, she said. Someone who came into another person's life and made honesty harder to avoid. The ex exhaled and almost laughed. After all the suspicion, all the comparison, all the effort spent trying to decode you, the answer was unexpectedly human. You were not some impossible mystery. You had simply shown up with a combination of warmth and boundaries that your special person was not prepared to encounter. You had seen them without worshipping them. Cared without losing yourself. Offered closeness without demanding performance. And when the connection stopped being healthy enough for your heart, you had allowed distance rather than turning love into a struggle for control. That was who you had become in their memory, not the person who forced them to change, but the person around whom they realized change was necessary. The reading could have ended there. In fact, the psychic began gathering the photographs and papers on the table. The X seemed ready to leave with a strange new piece. But the third party remained seated. Something had returned to their mind. A detail from earlier that day. Something your special person had done only hours before the psychic appointment, something neither the X nor the psychic knew anything about. "There's one more thing," the third party said. The psychic stopped. The X slowly sat back down. The third party reached into their pocket and placed their phone on the table. They explained that your special person had asked them a question that morning casually enough that it seemed meaningless at first. But after everything they had just heard, the question no longer sounded casual at all. Your special person had asked, "Do you think some apologies come too late?" The psychic did not answer immediately. Instead she asked, "What did you tell them?" The third party swallowed. "I said sometimes." Then the psychic asked the question that caused the room to become completely still again, "And what did they say after that?" The third party looked at your photograph one last time before whispering the response your special person had given, "Then I need to figure out whether I'm apologizing because I missed them, or because I finally understand what I did." And in that quiet sentence, the psychic realized there was still one final layer nobody in that room had uncovered, because your special person had apparently remembered one specific moment between you very differently than everyone else believed, and that memory was the real reason they had begun questioning everything.